All right, we're now going to transition to our third panel. So it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of that panel on nuclear colonialism, resisting, repairing, remembering. Our moderator for today will be Luis Mahuchante, who is a professor here at the University of Texas, a longtime collaborator, supporter, and steering committee member of the Rappaport Center, and director of the university's program in Native American and Indigenous Studies. So really no one better to launch our conversation, and he's going to introduce our first speaker.
Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. Marimari po Peñi, Marimari po Lamgen, Marimari Compuche. An indigenous Mapuche greeting for everyone. Welcome to this conversation. My full name is Luis Cárcamo Huechante. I'm a Mapuche, an indigenous Mapuche person and a scholar, originally from South America. I am an indigenous guest on these native lands here in what is called today Central Texas. So first of all, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that this afternoon we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, one of the ancestral names for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cochata, Cabo, Carrizo Comertudo, Cuauhtecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Ipanapache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in what is today called Texas. Welcome. This panel is titled Nuclear Colonialism, Remembering, Resisting, and Repairing. The panel will center indigenous responses to what is often called nuclear colonialism, defined by Danielle Endres in 2009 as a system of domination, nuclear colonialism, a system of domination through which governments and corporations target indigenous peoples and their lands to maintain the nuclear production process. Drawing connections between generations and geographies. Our four panelists this afternoon, they will discuss different ways in which indigenous peoples have excavated cultural memory and mobilized transnational solidarity to resist and repair the harms wrought by nuclear toxicity across different native nations and continents, from the Pacific Islands to the territories of the Navajo and Sahtu Dene. Our four speakers for this afternoon are our guests, Rebecca Hogue, David Eng, Jennifer Graver, and Jan Zabarte. So each speaker will have around 15 minutes to present, and then we will have time around 30 minutes by the end for the open dialogue, open conversation. Let me introduce, first of all, Professor Rebecca Hogue. Rebecca Hogue, who will become a colleague soon at the University of Toronto. Rebecca Hogue is a postdoctoral fellow at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University at this moment. Hogue writes and teaches about empire, militarization, and the environment in the Pacific Islands and Oceania. She's currently working on a book manuscript titled Nuclear Archipelagos, on women's anti-nuclear arts and literature of the Pacific. In 2024, Dr. Ho will join the faculty at the University of Toronto as an assistant professor in the Department of English. Let's welcome Dr. Ho.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction and for reminding us so importantly where we are. As you said, my name is Rebecca Hogue, and I come to you today where I'm a guest on Massachusetts land, otherwise known as Cambridge, Massachusetts. And originally I grew up as the descendant of Scottish immigrants on the island of Oahu in the Pai'aina of Hawaii, which is currently in its 131st year of illegal military occupation by the United States. I grew up one town over from one of the many military bases on the island, where we experienced the everyday noise pollution and other pollutions brought on by the everyday militarism that violently pervades the Pai'aina, the archipelago. And so in my work, I see it as my settler responsibility to speak about and speak out about the effects of imperialism, militarization, and military pollution across not only the place that I have been privileged to get to call home, but also a responsibility to the larger region that I consider myself to be a part of, which is the Pacific Islands and Oceania. And that's what's brought me to this work, this comparative work, this transnational work in thinking about comparative militarisms across the Pacific Ocean. And so that is what has brought me to this work today, to discuss the work of the great glass artist Ioane Scarce and her poetic interlocutors. So at the eastern edge of Australia's largest desert, the Great Victoria Desert, named for Queen Victoria in 1875, Maralinga and the Woomera Prohibited Zone, a mostly flat red earth, is surrounded by sandhills dotted with saltbush and spinifex, filled with bush fruit and a cacophony of hundreds of species of birds. With scorching days and cold nights and little rainfall, it can be an unforgiving landscape, one that requires ancestral knowledge in order to survive it. In the atomic detonations of what was called Operation Buffalo and the nearly 200 minor trials thereafter, each of these communities would become in what other nuclear survivor communities are called downwinders. The area, which stretches across the traditional lands of 6 indigenous groups, now encompasses 127,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of England or Florida, but most of the lands remain inaccessible to their traditional owners despite their legal return in 2009. When the United Kingdom, in partnership with the Australian government, detonated 12 nuclear weapons on 3 different sites of Aboriginal country in northwestern and South Australia from 1952 to 1963, they did so under the veil of government secrecy, with little to no information disseminated to the Australian public during or after the detonations. But 60 years after these last detonations at Maralinga, despite the advocacy of many generations, remediation efforts and nuclear justice at Maralinga remains both unresolved and largely unknown outside of the impacted region. So to address this ignorance and apathy of the ongoing militarization of the area known as the Woomera Prohibited Zone, Indigenous women, artists, and poets continue the legacy of anti-nuclear activism through now widely disseminated arts. In 2016, Gugutha Nukunu experimental glass artist Ioane Scarce exhibited her large-scale hanging structure seen here, made of individually blown glass yams in the shape of a mushroom cloud. she named Thunder Raining Poison. To prepare for this installation, Scarce and her team of glassblowers visited the breakaway test site at Maralinga. There, the ground was made so hot by the bomb, it turned to glass. At once visually arresting and emotionally stirring, Scarce's work inspired Yunkajatjara poet Ali Kabi Eckermann to engage directly with her pieces in her own medium. We talked about this briefly recently, while the visual often dominates nuclear discourses, think about the proliferation that we have seen, I mean that pun intended, of mushroom clouds or of apocalyptic films, right, like Gojira, or even this month's New York Times fear-inducing opinion piece that included a graphic component. The works that I'm interested in thinking about here are deliberately exploring the relationship between the senses in order to address Indigenous histories that, as we've talked about quite a lot already, these Indigenous histories that are too often left out. As I explore in the longer version of this chapter, which is part of my book manuscript, the poem that I'll be discussing today is a work of ekphrasis, what is commonly defined as the verbal representation of visual representation, or the translation from one medium to another. But the urgency of what it means to do so in the context of the nuclear age and in a region of trans-Indigenous life, and as I will talk about today, and of death. Together, these works I'll talk about explore the long history of Indigenous removal in Aboriginal country and interrogate the material and the aesthetic relationships between trans-historical arts and the legacies of radiation empires through place-based knowledges. These commitments, as we'll see here, to anti-nuclear genealogies suggest the ways that nuclear proliferation in the 21st century is felt from the inside out, in food, in body, and in breath. Glass artist Yewani Scarce, belonging to the Gugutha and Nukunu people of South Australia, was born in 1973 in the Woomera Prohibited Zone. After graduating from her master's degree, she quickly won many awards that enabled her to travel to sites around the world and visit memorials to the victims of genocide and nuclear devastation. She went to Auschwitz-Birkenau, Chernobyl, Fukushima. She went to Wounded Knee. Through these visits, she realized how no such monuments existed for her community or her country, and identified the need for physical reminders where stories are all too fleeting and altogether absent. In 2016, she created this installation, Thunder Raining Poison. The title, Thunder, plays on the name given to the area by the British military, Maralinga, which is often translated as meaning thunder, but has a disputed origin. It's over 5 meters high and includes over 2,000 yams. Its size, its technical complexity, and environmental absurdity. Think, for instance, dark floating yams when it's raining in the desert, right? This doesn't necessarily make any sense. But all of this she's trying to demonstrate contributes to its terror. And to add to this fear-inducing effect, it is suspended from the ceiling in the shape of a dissipating mushroom cloud, refracted with lights in the gallery, thus simultaneously still, but giving the illusion of being in motion. The implied movement in the piece has distinct historical resonances in both Australia and in other comparative nuclear contexts in the Pacific. The movement recalls how the clouds from the detonations at Maralinga traveled across Gugutha country, affecting thousands of people in the immediate aftermath and countless more in the future, and therefore illustrating what the scholar Elizabeth DeLugri has called the atomic scientist, quote, myth of isolates, that a so-called isolated place in the Western gaze enables a laboratory of containment. Like the American Castle Bravo scandal, which has been mentioned several times over the last couple days, in which the fallout from the mushroom cloud traveled far larger and wider than the Atomic Energy Commission had anticipated, Operation Buffalo proceeded with its detonations despite meteorological data that suggested risks to the surrounding communities. In other words, they knew that it was going to harm people. They did it anyway. Emerging from the earth, these yams that we see here also signify the irradiation of food after a nuclear detonation. Food transmuting into weapons, continuing to irradiate the bodies of those in their path. Yams not only here symbolize hidden or suppressed stories, but point to specific environmental knowledges that have genealogical implications. Scarce's work demonstrates the intricacies of the depth of knowledge with each single yam and each part of a larger system of ancestral knowledge. These yams also point to their seasonality, cyclicality, sustainability, and the demands of gendered labor. Although these yams are life-sustaining, Scarce's yams also reinforce the necropolitical contexts. Death is not something that Scarce is actually trying to hide from. In fact, it is the tension between life and death that is her point. The food that should sustain kills, and what kills in her work now sustains these stories after death. Particularly given their long rounded shape, the yams also symbolize and resemble humans, or more specifically, corpses. Historically, although that there were some documented deaths immediately following the detonations at Maralinga, there has never been a full accounting of all those killed because of the weapons, both in the immediate aftermath and in the ensuing generations. The yams too have a physical edge, as you can see. Often when traveling with her exhibits around the world, when she and I talked about her work, she said that customs agents would actually question whether the yams were knives or grenades. Each one of these yams does look like a dagger, threatening to drop on the viewer at any moment. With its implied movement and its dissipating shape, there's also no telling which direction it might travel and who might be caught in its path. She continues with these horticultural symbols in Strontium 90, an installation of hand-blown bush fruits placed in neonatal baby cribs. This moves from the looming mushroom cloud to the intimacy of a child's crib or cot and reveals the long-term devastation of radiation. Here she juxtaposes blown glass bush fruits sitting or lying on top of the cribs and mortuary tables against a photograph of the Woomera Cemetery. The cemetery is disproportionately filled with graves of newborns and stillborn babies from the middle of the 20th century. This is devastating history indeed. These unfortunately have distinct historical resonances. In 1957, the last year of the Maralinga detonations, a variety of testing for strontium 90 was ordered by the Atomic Research Establishment and the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment to sample the soil, vegetation, milk, as well as sheep bones. But also this part of this study, which was part of a larger international study called Project Sunshine, tested the bones of 22,000 deceased children, primarily across Australia and Papua New Guinea, without the consent of their parents. Project Sunshine, along with Project 4.1, which Betty so eloquently invoked yesterday, of the United States, and I've had the privilege of writing about this elsewhere, studied the effects of radiation on human beings also without consent. And these are among the most controversial and ethically violent violations during the nuclear detonation period. In Scarce's Strontium 90, the blown glass bush fruits continue this theme of food, but also food's enmeshment, or even synecdochal relationship with bodies. The bush fruits as babies perform the consistent presence of radiation from birth to death. Scarce's bush fruits are rendered sterile, cold, and devoid of comforts. There are no sheets, there are no blankets. They are alone. In contrast, some might recall also what Betty mentioned yesterday, the extraordinarily moving speech by the great Marshallese activist Darlene Keshe Johnson, who spoke at the World Council of Churches in 1983, who talked about the devastating loss of molar pregnancies, or so-called jelly babies or jellyfish babies, in which women compared their babies to turtles, octopuses, and others, trying to make the unfathomable, the unrecognizable, into recognizable, into making them kin. In the process of making bush fruits, Scarce too is confronted with these multi-species beings that she had made. In one profound experience she shared with me, she explained how in the process of making a bush fruit, she had punctured the side of the fruit and it looked like a gaping mouth. It's the one on the bottom left here. The release of the pressure created a horrible sound, and so she named it the screamer. She said, I had to take a break after that and ended the work. Her pieces are searing indictments of imperial negligence, how cold extractive logics and how environmental or scientific racism distances themselves and tries to hide multi-generational violence. Instead, these glass pieces display not only how radiation has permeated food, but how radiation itself bears fruit, reproducing itself over and over across lands and across generations. And I know that I'm already over time, and so I very quickly want to move and leave you with the great words of the Yunkajajara poet Ali Kabi Eckermann, who wrote a poem on thunder raining poison that she argues, she says, I write for both my families and my ongoing healing. Mostly, though, I write for an Aboriginal audience, she says, and she does this because she says, poetry saves lives. And so I'll leave you here with what she gives us in this beautiful concrete poem, where ultimately, in contrast to Scarce's work, which does not in fact make a sound, but asks us to speculate on the sounds associated or the sounds missing from the ways that we depict nuclear violence, or when we hear sounds, or when we should be expecting to hear sounds. So here she has in her final lines, she says, you can't break us. We're not glass. We are people. 2,000 or more, our spirit comes together. We made a heart. Did you see it? In the fragments. It's there in the glass. 2,000 or more. Our hearts grow as we mourn for our land. It's part of us. We love it, poisoned and all. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Rebecca. Our next speaker is Professor David Eng. David Eng is Richard Fisher Professor of English and Faculty Director of the program in Asian American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's also professor in the programs in comparative literature and literary theory and gender, sexuality, and women's studies. A specialist in American studies, Asian diaspora, critical race theory, psychoanalysis, and queer studies. Professor Eng is the author of several books, The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, 2010, and Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America, 2001. He's also co-author of the book Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation on the Social and Psychic Lives of Asian Americans. And currently, he's working on a book project titled Reparations and the Human, which explores the politics of reparations and human rights in Cold War Asia. His presentation today is titled Absolute Apology, Absolute Forgiveness. Let's welcome Professor David Eng.
Thank you, Luis. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you. I'm delighted to be here among old friends and meeting new friends as well. I'm told that we all have 15 minutes. I'm going to try to be a very good model minority and stick to the time limit. So I'm going to dive right in. But I really do want to thank Professor Hogue, Professor Engel, Cooper, and Caroline for all of their arrangements. And then now I have to go into my reading glasses. So it's time to retire. All right. So I am going to, Cooper, can we move to the next? I'm also a PowerPoint virgin. I only do Keynote, but now I am inaugurating PowerPoint at the University of Texas. So I am going to present from the final chapter of my forthcoming book, Reparations in the Human. It's going to come out from Duke at the end of the year. The book explores the history of reparations in Cold War Asia, beginning with New World dispossession and concluding with the biopolitical aftermath of atomic destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Given my limited time today, I will offer a brief introduction to the book and then a short reading of the last chapter, Absolute Apology, Absolute Forgiveness. And here's a table of contents. Now, that last chapter explores the history of uranium mining, and in particular, Little Boy, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So here's the overview. Two catastrophes in the 20th century marked a radical shift in our conceptions of the human being. The Holocaust and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki invoked in graphic terms the specter of total human destruction. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt famously wrote that citizenship is no more or no less than the right to have rights. And she observed in the context of European warfare and its crises of statelessness that, quote, the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human, end quote. Indeed, skeletal figures liberated by Allied troops from German death camps and the suppurated frames of survivors of nuclear disaster in Japan stretched Arendt's trenchant analyses of totalitarianism and the human imagination itself to index a realm of bare life altogether beyond rights of those with no right to live at all. In response, a new international order of human rights with attendant notions of reparations arose from the ruins of World War II. This new legal regime sought to subrogate the sovereignty of the nation state in the hopes of defending the sovereignty of the individual. Traditionally, reparations could be claimed by one state from another as compensation for the costs of war. For the first time in history, reparations were extended to encompass individual and group claims against state-sponsored violence in the name of human rights. While genocide and nuclear holocausts oriented the world imagination toward the specter of planetary annihilation, the final solution and the atomic bombings also cleave from one another in significant ways. In the space of post-war Europe, the history of the Holocaust is settled. Nazis were perpetrators and Jews were victims. In contrast, in the space of post-war Asia, there was and continues to be little historical consensus as to who was the victim and who was the perpetrator in the aftermath of atomic destruction. I begin with this significant disjuncture to explore a history of reparations, the human and human rights in relation to Cold War Asia. Reparation is a key term not only in political theory, but also in psychoanalysis, in particular object relations, yet the two are rarely discussed in relation to one another. While political theory conceives of reparations more as a noun, an event, a response, an accounting, a payment meant to write a history of violence into the past, psychoanalysis regards the concept more as a verb, a continuous process mediating relations of love and hate among contending subjects. We should not bemoan this slippage. To the contrary, the gap between reparations as a noun and making reparation as a verb keeps open a space for new victims to be apprehended and new injuries to be claimed. Part 1, Political and Psychic Genealogies in Locke and Klein, traces a conceptual history of reparations from the political theories of John Locke to the psychoanalytic theories of Melanie Klein, beginning with European discovery of the New World and ending with the nightmare of total war and genocide in the Old World. Here I examine how reparation becomes a key term for justifying the redistribution of life, liberty, and property under European modernity from the colonized to the colonizer. Part 2, War and Violence in the Trans-Pacific, continues this investigation by transporting us from the Holocaust to Hiroshima, from Nuremberg to the Tokyo War Tribunals, from the transatlantic to the Trans-Pacific, and from the age of colonization to decolonization. It brings together legal proceedings, reportage, and literature on war and violence across the Trans-Pacific, including the atomic bombings in Japan, the internment of Japanese Americans, and contemporary legal claims for redress by comfort women to rethink the transnational significance of reparations and human rights as they circulate globally during the post-war period. Part 3, Absolute Apology, Absolute Forgiveness, investigates the history of uranium mining, and in particular the story of Little Boy, the atomic bomb detonated by the US military over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Much of the world's uranium supply is mined from indigenous lands. The uranium for Little Boy came in part from the lands of the Sahtu Dene, an indigenous peoples who live on the shores of Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories of Canada. All right. I am more technical than I look. Okay, it worked. Here's the map. I get 15 seconds. Okay, ignorant at the time of how their mining efforts would be applied and the destination of the ore, the Sahtu Dene nonetheless felt implicated once they learned of Hiroshima's fate. In response to the disaster, they sent a delegation to Hiroshima to apologize. So the book begins with indigenous dispossession. It goes through Cold War Asia, and it ends back with indigenous dispossession. So let me turn to this last chapter, Absolute Apology, Absolute Forgiveness. The Canadian filmmaker Peter Blow has produced a moving and oftentimes angering 1999 documentary, A Village of Widows, chronicling this story of toxic colonialism in Sahtu Dene territories. The first part of Blow's film relates the history of uranium mining at Port Radium and of chronic death and disease that plagues the community. The second part of the film follows the failed attempts of a group of community elders who traveled to Ottawa to petition the Canadian government for relief. The final part of the documentary tracks the delegation's journey to Hiroshima in 1998. There, the group visits memorial sites, attends a ceremony for the dead, and meets with the Hiroshima Peace Committee. The penultimate scene of A Village of Widows shows the delegation visiting a hospital for hibakusha, those who survived the atomic bombs, but one that is racially segregated, according to the narrator. This clinic is designated specifically for Korean hibakusha, 30,000 conscripted laborers from Japan's colonial empire. Before I show you a clip from the scene, let me take a brief detour through Jacques Derrida, from whom I derive my concept of absolute apology. Look, I'm based in the English department. I love it that I'm in a law school. You guys are gonna have to listen to Derrida. Suck it up. On cosmopolitanism and forgiveness, Derrida offers a counterintuitive notion of forgiveness, of absolute forgiveness, suggesting that the only thing worth forgiving is, in fact, the unforgivable. Forgiveness is not it should not be normative, normalizing. It should remain exceptional and extraordinary in the face of the impossible, as if it interrupted the ordinary course of historical temporality. On the one hand, Derrida suggests what can be forgiven, what can be pardoned, is invariably tied to political calculation, aligned with a set of intended political consequences and effects. For instance, a perpetrator apologizes, and a victim, in the face of this performative demand, is burdened with the imperative to forgive, inserted into a dialectic of apology and forgiveness, reparations and reconciliation, ultimately serving to underwrite literal narratives of progress. In this instance, reparation operates more as a noun, as an authorized account of injury and harm, a dialectic binding apology to forgiveness, reparation to reconciliation. In short, it serves to write a history of colonial violence into the past. One, as we see in the case of toxic empire and its ongoing effects, is temporally impossible. On the other hand, to forgive the unforgivable, to forgive in the absence of apology or demand, shatters such liberal narratives of completion and unity. By dissociating apology from forgiveness and victims from perpetrators, the calculability of politics cleaves from the incalculability of justice. Admittedly, as Derrida observes, absolute forgiveness is mad, quote, a madness of the impossible. It is even perhaps the only thing that arrives, that surprises like a revolution, the ordinary course of history, politics, and law, end quote. In this instance, absolute forgiveness functions to frame reparation more as a verb, a continuous process drawing attention to the insistent gap between law and justice. If, as Derrida suggests, absolute forgiveness demands forgiving that which is unforgivable, I would like to propose that absolute apology involves apologizing for that which you are not quite responsible. The Sahtu Dene's surprising act interrupts, like uranium itself, the ordinary course of things. Dispossessed of their land by colonial settlers, targeted by state violence and neglect, and suffering from unspeakable personal losses and environmental devastation, the Sahtu Dene nonetheless apologize. In the absence of political coercion or demand, they voluntarily assume the mantle of perpetrator and take responsibility for their role in the atomic disaster, for a violence and misery that claims them as much as any other. What is at stake when the most vulnerable and victimized nonetheless assume the mantle of perpetrator? The Sahtu Dene, by cleaving to the victims of the atomic bombing, assent to a notion of history, to cite Kathy Carruth, as a phenomenon of being, quote, implicated in each other's traumas, end quote. Exceptional and extraordinary, their act blurs the line between victim and perpetrator itself, and it illustrates the ethical stakes of claiming such a position. Those stakes are high, for the Sahtu Dene's apology presents us with a different notion of responsibility and repair, one in which we must take account for, as well as respond to, events beyond clear notions of agency, linear concepts of cause and effect, and even the immediate consequences and results of decisions made by others. If responsibility emerges, as Emmanuel Levinas argues, as a consequence of being subject to the unwilled address of the other, the Sahtu Dene's response to this unanticipated address demonstrates how violence and accountability are ethically shorn from conventional politics of reparation and reconciliation. It loosens the dialectic of apology and forgiveness, victim and perpetrator, on which legal claims for reparations have been predicated under the liberal state and its politics of recognition. After all, legal claims for reparation and human rights are predicated on trauma, not as a shared phenomenon in which we are all implicated, but rather as a psychic injury arrogated by one group over another in the calculated politics of identity and victimhood under Western law. So I have to change my glasses. I don't know how much time I've left. I have a few seconds. All right, well, then, you guys are not going to get to see this clip. So I was going to show you a 2-minute clip. Go for it. Go for it? All right. I have permission. I have 1 minute. I know. I'm turning the audience against you. I'm so sorry. It's like a horrible form of triangulation. Oh, I can't show the clip. I think I'm on the wrong. I'm on the wrong thing. I think it's the other.
Can it go in?
I think it's the other PowerPoint.
After all this much talking it up.
There it is.
There we go.
Look, it's arrived. Okay.
Gotta actually switch it over.
I have to go to 43.
Sorry, I gotta do this.
Okay. This is a 2-minute clip and then I have 1-minute comment. Right, so 1 minute. Let me end today by asking this question. What does it mean for the Sahtu Dene to apologize to Japanese hibakusha? And what does it mean for them to apologize to Korean hibakusha, 30,000 colonial subjects forced into conscripted labor by the Japanese imperial war machine? There's a telling detail in the soundtrack of this hospital scene. The entire exchange between Blondin and the Korean hibakusha is mediated not in their native tongues, Slavi and Korean, but rather through the dominant language of the colonizers, English and Japanese. These linguistic transformations and interruptions open upon a larger historical and political landscape of state violence and trauma framed by atomic disaster that brings them together even as it pulls apart these two subaltern communities. The contingent bonds that Blondin's scene of apology establish with their counterparts in Hiroshima are fleeting. Yet, in their contingency, they impart an invaluable lesson for alternative strategies of repair. As Blondin concludes his remarks, he is greeted by a round of hearty applause and arigatos. He is then given a firm handshake from one of the Korean hibakusha who have gathered on the hospital beds around him. This man inquires through another translator in the room, and you see the exchange. This scene of heightened feeling deserves attention. Mistaken for the Japanese colonizer, Blondin's rejoinder, "Oh, not quite the same," as well as his wishes to get married in Japan, but nobody look at me, fills the room with laughter. Despite this misrecognition of their various national and racial differences, of disparate histories of colonialism and empire, and confusion between victims and perpetrators, an atmosphere of palpable conviviality descends upon the group. This affective tie, I suggest, brings the Sahtu Dene and the Korean hibakusha together, despite their considerable differences, in a manner markedly divergent from the ways in which their propinquity is instrumentalized by the sovereign state and its politics of recognition. In the final analysis, absolute apology, unconditional but without sovereignty, in Derrida's words, not only exposes the political failures of the state to protect the sanctity of all human and non-human life, but also reworks its sovereign mandates to propose a different model of reparations and the human to emerge. It not only dissociates the unconditional from the sovereign, but also allows justice to maintain, in the words of Carolyn de Cruz, quote, openness to the singular and the specific, to the other who slips beneath the calculability of the law, end quote. It provides a social and psychic roadmap for how bad objects abandoned by the state might nonetheless address and repair one another, to become human by endowing each other with recognition and value. We repair only that which is valuable to us. Nobody look at me, Blondin laments to his convivial audience. Instead, they look at each other. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is my colleague, Professor Jennifer Graver, from here at UT Austin. Professor Graver is a member of the faculty in religious studies and associate director of the program in Native American and Indigenous Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Graver works on Native American religions, religion and violence, and interreligious encounters in American prisons and on the American frontier. She has published the books The Furnace of Affliction, Prisons and Religions in Antebellum America, published in 2011, and a second book, The Gods of Indian Country, Religion and the Struggle for the American West, published in 2018. Her new project, Our World Renewed, Ghost Dancing Across Native North America, focuses on Native actors, sources, and epistemologies in the so-called Ghost Dance of 1890. Recently, Professor Graver has received fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her presentation today is titled Only a Piece of the Total Prophecy, Ghost Dancing Against Nuclear Waste. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you to our organizers, and thank you to my fellow panelists. and to all of you who are here today. In 1997, Mr. Maurice Eben testified on behalf of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe before the Nevada Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He addressed the commission's plan to transport spent nuclear fuel, essentially nuclear waste, through his tribal lands. Eben said the tribe had not been consulted properly, a violation of the 1970 National Environmental Policy Act. His people did not have an opportunity to voice their objections, which were multifold. Nuclear waste, Eben insisted in his testimony, was simply, quote, not part of our Indian society. He then provided a primer on that society. He told them where he came from, what Paiute band his parent belonged to, what territories in the Great Basin he lived in and visited, how his parents were forced to enroll in boarding school, and how later he and his family left the reservation in order to find work, in order to eat. Then he went back further into the Paiute past. He told of the establishment of the Pyramid Lake Reservation in 1874, pictured here in red. Then he went still further to speak of oral histories and scientific evidence, namely petroglyphs, that showed Numic peoples had lived in the Great Basin for at least 15,000 years. Paiute ancestors, Eben claimed, were buried in the valleys and rock crevices throughout this landscape. The graves, he said, were, quote, prepared with loving care, with placemats made of tule reeds. Food was stored in willow-woven baskets. Blankets made of rabbit hides were made to keep the body warm. Clothing was made for the journey home, end quote. It was this land and among these graves through which nuclear materials were proposed to be moved. Eben then referenced a particular episode in Paiute history that informed his relationship to this landscape and these ancestors, the ghost dance and its first leader, Wodziwub. In 1869, he says, a man named Wodziwub had a vision and saw that the dead would soon return. He taught his people a dance and songs to accompany it. He promised that dancing would not only accelerate the arrival of the ancestors, but also, quote, shake off the sicknesses and bring water in its many forms to cleanse and replenish us. The ghost dance, according to Eben's telling, healed and resurrected human beings, as well as replenished the landscape's waterways, which had been devastated by settler irrigation projects and mining practices and were under threat again from nuclear waste. But Eben wasn't finished. That's because, he insisted, the ghost dance wasn't finished. In 1980, he said, the movement had been reprised as the prophecy, his word, had promised. Stanley Smart, he told the commission members, a member of the nearby Fort McDermott Paiute tribe, had brought the movement again to Pyramid Lake. Smart told Eben and others that Wodziwub's movement, the first ghost dance, was, quote, only a piece of the total prophecy, and that now was the time to gather and dance and make the sound the Creator is waiting for us to make. This characterization of the ghost dance as something reprised in 1980 and invoked before Nuclear Regulatory Commission meetings does not appear in standard accounts of the movement, which normally describe it as a 19th century Native revitalization or prophetic movement. And if you'll bear with me for a moment as I talk about the ghost dance and its popular and scholarly interpretations, I'll get to why this matters for understanding Native anti-nuclear activism as well as other forms of environmental activism in the late 20th and into the 21st century. In brief, for decades, anthropologists and historians have described the ghost dance as one example of a kind of universal religious revitalization phenomenon consisting of ecstatic behaviors and apocalyptic visions brought on by the deprivations of colonial invasion. These scholars have bemoaned how Americans responded to the ghost dance, including the 1890 massacre of more than 300 Lakota participants in the movement at Wounded Knee. As such, the ghost dance and Wounded Knee have become symbols for many of a kind of last gasp of Native resistance to American invasion and empire. This approach is exemplified in Neihart's best-selling book, Black Elk Speaks, in the 1930s, and has been replicated by historians for decades. Until it wasn't. Changes in scholarly approaches, including what's been called the New Indian history, prompted new ghost dance interpretations. Scholars began attending more to Native perspectives, considering Native traditions and prerogatives. Even so, I'd say problems remain. Take, for example, Louis Warren's Bancroft Prize-winning 2017 book, God's Red Sun, in which he argues that the ghost dance was actually a, quote, forward-looking, pragmatic religion engaged with the modern industrial Gilded Age. Warren's evidence for this claim, that the movement's leaders advised its followers to work for cash wages. The ghost dance, according to Warren, asked its followers to adjust to conquest as a kind of pragmatic survival strategy. This seems odd to me, or at least at odds with references to the movement that have been made by Native activists like Eben, as well as tribal historians and Indigenous artists throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. For example, consider the American Indian movement leader Russell Means as he reflected on the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. Oops, where did that go? Ooh, I lost a slide here. Oh, sorry, I didn't advance that before. The white man says that the 1890 massacre was the end of the wars with the Indian, that it was the end of the Indian, the end of the ghost dance. Yet here we are at war. We're still Indians, and we're ghost dancing again. Or consider Leslie Barman Silko's 1991 novel, Almanac for the Dead, that ends with a ghost dance reprisal in an Arizona convention center, bringing people from throughout the hemisphere. Or this exhibit from 2013 in Toronto of Indigenous artists that takes the ghost dance as its inspiration for bringing Indigenous artists together, still active in their communities. And I could include so many more, including protesters who talked about Wovoka and the ghost dance at the No Dapple protests up in the Dakotas just a few years ago. When I see these references, I do not see a pragmatic adjustment to conquest. So I want to think about Eben's statement before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as one among many ways Native activists invoke spiritual traditions in the face of their ongoing challenges. And one way to do that is to use historian Paul Rosier's work on Native environmental activism that started in the 1950s and really blossomed in the 1970s. Rosier quotes Kiowa writer M. Scott Momaday on what he calls, or what Momaday identified as emerging Indian voices in relation to environmental destruction at a planetary level. According to Rosier, these emerging voices highlighted environmental concerns both within and beyond Native communities. But then they did two more things that he really wants us to pay attention to. They connected these issues of environmental destruction to Native sovereignty, and they invoked their particular cultural traditions, including spiritual and religious traditions, to recommend paths forward, not only for themselves, but for others, for non-Native people as well. Rosier details Native folks who fought dams and reservoirs, who resisted hunting and fishing regulations, and extractive industries. And he offers an extended look in his work at Navajo and Hopi protest against the Black Mesa mine. I think Rosier's analysis helps us understand Eben's resistance to the transport of nuclear waste and provides an opportunity for a more robust understanding of how emerging Indian voices, to use his term, invoke spiritual and religious traditions to do this work. So I want to go a little bit deeper into Eben's story. And to do that, I rely on both public and archival records, as well as interviews I've done with Paiute elders, especially a woman named Billie Jean Guerrero, who worked with both Stanley Smart and Mr. Eben in the 1970s and 80s, and who currently directs the Tribal Museum at Pyramid Lake. According to census data, Stanley Smart, this new ghost dance prophet in 1980, was born in Paiute country around 1931. He was married by 1950 and worked on a ranch. Oops, I'm gonna go back to this picture. Oops. He appeared briefly in a 1950 short film about Paiute farm laborers. And according to some sources, he and his wife had 9 children. He's pictured with one here. Later, Mr. Smart appeared in a burst of news articles after getting in some legal trouble. In 1968, he was arrested for breaking hunting laws. In his court appearance, Smart said he was hunting to feed his family because he'd been laid off from his job at a mercury mine. He also, in his court appearance, stated that he rejected Nevada's authority to limit Paiute hunting on their own homelands. Of course, Smart's actions and words reflect events in broader Native activism and activist circles, which included fish-ins in the Pacific Northwest and hunting protests in places like Wisconsin and Oklahoma. Given that the year 1968, it should also not surprise us that his story was picked up in Native newspapers with activist leanings, including Akwasansi Notes in October 1969. But to point to to look at Rosé's point about the way that Native environmental activism overlapped with the broader environmental movement, his story also appeared in a number of alternative newspapers, including the Berkeley Barb, the Ann Arbor Sun, the East Village Other, and the San Francisco Express Times, among others, all featuring the story of this Paiute man arrested for hunting in his own homeland. Simultaneously, some of the most prominent actions of the Red Power era, including the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz Island by Indians of all tribes, included statements about environmental protection and its connection to Native sovereignty. Indeed, shortly after the Alcatraz occupation, members of Indian of all tribes caravanned to Pyramid Lake in Paiute country to assist those folks in protecting their water rights that were under threat in that region. We know that Smart's activism continued after 1968, even though the paper trail disappears, because in interviewing Paiute elders like Ms. Guerrero, she discussed working with him and Mr. Eben throughout the 1970s, including the three of them participating together in segments of the 1978 Longest Walk, done by prominent activists. All of this activism coincided with Paiute cultivation of memories and stories about the ghost dance. 1973 brought the celebration of the first Wovoka Days at a local high school, followed by a similar celebration at Paiute's Walker River Reservation in 1975. That same year, Paiutes in Yarrington, nearby, began efforts to raise a Wovoka statue. In 1976, Walker River's tribal historian published an article on Wovoka in Nevada's Pan-Indian newspaper. So there's activism happening at the same time that the people are interviewing elders and recalling this movement from the late 19th century. So it's in this period of activism and re-engagement with the story that Stanley Smart, drawing on all of these experiences, claims that this prophecy is still unfolding, that he's received a vision to bring it back, that the dance has returned, a dance that blesses the landscape and that heals people. And if we go back to his 1968 arrest, here's one of the pieces of coverage, we can see that he actually mirrors some of the language that's attributed to the movement's leaders from 1890. At the trial, he says, "We prayed for the success of this trial. Never have we given away or sold the land we used. White men provoke the violence of nature by abusing the land and life of the traditional way. We have medicine in our religion that will stop destruction by earthquakes, floods, and hurricanes that will come if the white man does not correct himself. We pray for the white man to correct himself. We pray for the protection of those who, by helping Indians in their struggle, are correcting themselves." Let me wrap up here. Smart and Eben carried all of these experiences with them by the time Congress designated the nuclear test site at Yucca Mountain nearby in the early 1980s, a site that would bring about the transport of nuclear waste materials through their homelands. And so this backdrop, I think, helps us understand Eben's testimony, why he would become before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and say, Wovoka has taught us, Wodziwub has taught us how to interact with this land. Sorry, I lost my place there. And that what he was doing in some ways is we can see what Rosier has identified, that Eben was saying this is an issue of environmental concern to all, of Native people in particular, but that it also has relevance for Native sovereignty in that we have not been consulted as law demands, and that we will draw on our cultural traditions to resist it. So I see him as one of these emerging Indian voices. My research is primarily concerned with interpretations of the ghost dance, but Iben's experience, I think, is also helpful for understanding Native anti-nuclear activism more broadly. I think we could do more to understand how people invoke those spiritual traditions. I would love, and I'm trying to convince an undergraduate right now to do some work on women of all red nations who spoke in particular about the effects on women's bodies of nuclear testing and nuclear waste. Because I think they also have, I think, some ways that we can understand how they invoke spiritual traditions as well. And I really also see an overlap with the kind of, with the folks who are also arguing in court for the repatriation of ancestral remains. And as one scholar has said, these kinds of statements have what he calls a tremendous moral gravity, a kind of moral certainty that operates very effectively in these contexts where they're seeking protection of lands and people. And I would just urge us all to continue our investigations so that we might both learn from them, but also perhaps, I think, as Iben has asked us to be inspired by them to do something. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. Our fourth speaker for this afternoon is Principal Man Jan Sabarte, who is Secretary of State of the Western Shoshone National Council of the Western Bands of the Shoshone Nation of Indians, and he's also the Secretary of the Native Community Action Council. Mr. Sabarte was formerly a rancher, managing horses and cattle, when the U.S. Bureau of Land Management blamed the Shoshone for the destruction of the land caused by radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons tests, destroying the Shoshone ranching economy contemplated by the treaty. Mr. Sabarte watched his family suffer the devastating adverse health effects of radiation exposure to his family, people, and land. And he has spent decades advocating for the end of nuclear weapons testing and for the end of the radiation. And he also has a struggle for the Radiation Compensation Act passed in 1990. Mr. Sabarte seeks creation of the treaty guaranteed reservation and equal protection of his land and people from extractive mineral exploitation and relief from the health consequences of nuclear weapons testing. Let's welcome Mr. Sabarte.
Mahogany, Raymond Yao. Greetings on behalf of Chief Raymond Yao, my chief for the last 40 years, and I want to thank the Rappaport Center for inviting me here to present. It's a very tough subject, and I'm glad that we're discussing it openly. We haven't been doing that for a long time, and in some parts of this country, it is not discussed, such as around Las Vegas, because people are entertained. So I'm going to start by letting you know that I am water, and I know what we're trying to protect. We know what we're trying to protect. We're trying to protect that pure water. We're all water. We all need pure water to grow and develop. That's what makes us different from scientists and engineers. Scientists want to do pure science. They need money to do that. Engineers can build anything. They need money to do that. I don't need that to protect my land and people. I need people to engage themselves and understand what is at risk. In the Great Basin, we have the oldest life in the world. We have the 11,700-year-old creosote, or Yatumbi as we call it in our language, which is billions of plants, all from one king clone in the Mojave Desert. 11,700 years old. We have the single oldest trees, the 6,800-year-old bristlecone pine. We have the 25 square mile, 80,000 years and older pando. This is a diploid tree connected underground. That's what we're trying to protect. And unfortunately, that's what is being put at risk. So I start with this definition of what's happening in my country. There are laws. We are a nation of laws, not America, the Shoshone Nation. We have constitutional protection. And this is a nice way of saying genocide, because that's really what is happening in my country, and we need to talk about this. Before the United States, there was the Spanish, and they came through my country, enslaved my people, and committed genocide. In these missions here, the roof tiles were made on the women's thighs. This is in California. And the bricks were made by the men. Our hair, our sweat, our tears, our blood, our bodies are in every brick and tile. Genocide comes in waves. So I'll just use this map right here. This is our healing center. I'm from Las Vegas. The Nevada test site's about here. There'll be another one. The yellow is Shoshonean, Numic speaking. So after the Spaniards in 1850 came to the United States, and California passed an act for the governance and protection of the Indians, which paid $25 a scalp for Indians. Indian hunters made more money than miners did, and Wells Fargo brought the gold. So that's the second wave of genocide, and it didn't fully get repealed until 1967. 60% of our people were killed in the South there. We have five treaties with the United States. The United States tries to make us a subject of the United States by using a treaty reference of 18 Statute 689 through 692. We use the international reference, which is a volume of every treaty, valid treaty in the world, in the Oceana Press Consolidated Treaty Series, volume 127, 1863, which has all of the Shoshone treaties there, and likely every other Indian treaty. Treaties didn't give us anything. We owned everything. We had the best of everything. We had the affluent lifestyle. We had summer homes, winter homes, river homes, lake homes. We had the best of everything, and that all changed. This is the original map that went back with the 1863 treaties. We are Numic speaking, meaning the people. I am Nua, Nuana, the people. We also have Northern Paiute, which are, okay, I forget all of that. But what's important here is unexplored. This map isn't correct. It says Snakes and Paiutes here because they didn't know the Shoshone went all the way below. This is in 1863. And then this is the Shoshone Treaty. It's already ratified. The treaty's in full force and effect. I'm seeking to get the treaty reservations. That's 5 or 6. The president has to act for protection. I need a safe place. My family needs a safe place. We have a large internally and externally displaced population. After college, I went back to my community where there's so many experienced people with no education, but they're experienced at managing and administering these projects and federal funds. And I was fired because I reported federal fraud. There was no whistleblower act back then, but that's what's happening to my younger people. They get educated and there's no jobs for us. We need that treaty reservation. I don't want to complain. On the right is the map that I made. This is available from the Nevada Test Site Oral History Project at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. On the left here is the Indian Claims Commission map and the original treaty map. The problem with the Indian Claims Commission map is that it did not complete the congressionally mandated process, and it could never be complete. At a footnote in the Indian Claims Commission process, the final report to Congress, it said 20 claims could not be completed, 2, there was no finding that a taking had occurred, and 1 is the Shoshone case. It's important to recognize that Comanche are Shoshone. The youth were playing a rock throwing game, in our history, and one of the youth was killed. The father asked for punishment, who had warrior status, and he was granted banishment of that family east of the Rockies. They took the horses, and later on we reconciled. But the Shoshone language was used in World War I in the European theater. It was also, we were not U.S. citizens. We fought in alliance with other Americans. We signed the treaties in 1863 in alliance with Americans to make this nation what it is today. Our resources fuel this nation because America's need was great. And we did that to end slavery of all people. We have some understanding of these things. On the left is the big gun. On the right is a constitutional law argument about the original intent of the founding fathers, which was killing Indians. And so for me, it doesn't matter if it's an Armalite, an AR, AK, Kalashnikov, the gun size doesn't matter to me. These are weapons of war with only one design purpose. That's killing human beings. We should not be facing these weapons in a civil society. So if I get a chance to make a gun case with a lot of help, or maybe with no help, I will make it based on these weapons of war. This is the Princeton map. I asked a question yesterday about, or this morning, about the Anthropocene. I guess it was, whatever it was. This Princeton research, if you've looked or read it, says that it began in 5 years before the 1950 date, which many people are using, beginning with Trinity. And you can see the Trinity here. This is the Nevada test site. A lot of people think they're better off over here, but in 1986, there was an event, a venting and a test which killed workers, which destroyed the underground facilities, and the Department of Energy doesn't call it an accident because they manually vented this gases, and it went 13 miles high, went around the world 3 weeks before Chernobyl. And when the military were flying around calibrating their instruments, they located radiation before the Chernobyl radiation was expected to arrive. That was the Mighty Oak accident and cover-up. Yeah, it was an accident. Every underground test vents. So you think you're safe? No, we don't know how many times that happened. The Mighty Oak accident and cover-up. This is worth reading, though. This is the Princeton research, which is based on I think a 5-day, 10 days for Trinity, I think, and 5 days for the Nevada test site. And some of the places, Kansas and North Dakota, have some of the highest fallout. The cattle were milked. The milk was shipped to the cities. In Kansas, Kodak was complaining in New York because their film was being fogged. Corn husks were used to create packing material for the film, and that exposed the film. So the United States warned Kodak, but not the American population. This is a map created by the Department of Energy. It's cumulative estimates. We have a lot of these kinds of maps. These were made by the researchers driving up the highways every 2 miles and taking a reading. How much? Anyway, as mentioned earlier, they blamed our livestock for destruction of the range caused by the fallout from weapons testing, and we didn't know how to defend ourselves against this. And that was in 1990. We took our case to the Organization of American States with my council representative, Terry Gann. We won. The United States did violate our rights to due process and property. We also went to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And since 2006, the United States just has not responded. So we need to put pressure on this government to act responsibly. I don't know if that's possible. I'll take over then. This is where the United States only responds to us, and it claims the Johnson v. McIntosh, Worcester v. Georgia, and U.S. versus Cherokee Nation, which is the Marshall Trilogy that relies upon the 1452 and the 1493 intercentral bulls from the Pope as the basis for dominance and dominion of Christians over heathens, and savages. We are penalized for our lack of belief in Christianity. Marshall Trilogy. Here's a map from the 1997 National Cancer Institute. It took 14 years for them to produce this. Anybody can go to that website. Now, what happened is we put pressure on the World Court. We put pressure on the United Nations General Assembly, the International Labor Organization, and the World Health Organization. Tens of thousands of people from around the world came to our country. The Kazakhs stopped nuclear weapons testing because they would not build the bombs anymore. So they came to our country, and together we all put pressure on the United States, and we have a moratorium. After that, we sought, with a lot of support, to get that opinion out of the World Court, and worked with Peter and Cora Weiss in New York. We worked with Senator Glenn's office and a lot of people. I've been involved with this for 40 years, since 1984. After I came home and saw my family dying, pillars in our community dying. So I don't have a lot of the support that maybe you have of family. But I keep going because it's the right thing to do. It's important. These people killed my family, and they're not going to get away with it. And that's what we have today. The latest threat is the proposed Yucca Mountain high-level nuclear waste repository. It is still the law, okay? But I intervened in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with the only ownership contention. Nevada took $1 billion. Nevada takes that money, grants equal to taxes, payments equal to taxes, ad valorem taxes, gives that to every unit of local government except Indians. That's racism. That's fraud, defrauding us of our interest in the land, racketeering. That's what's happening. And now they hand it over to the dark-skinned person in Nevada. And those people are just carrying on. We need equal justice. We need to end the discrimination. We need to end the violence. Taxation without representation is how this country was founded. That's a violence. This is the actual written genocide created by the Department of Energy. Genocide became a crime in the United States in 1988 when President Ronald Reagan signed the Proxmire Act, the U.S. enactments of the UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Crime and Genocide. The Department of Energy created this out of their culture of secrecy. And in order to prove genocide, you must prove intent. The intent is the culture of secrecy because you don't know what's killing you when it's done in secret. Triage is a word of French origin, means to sort and cull according to quality. We don't have, it's normally used as just flood, famine, natural disaster. We don't have those things. What we have is a deliberate act of the United States government out of their culture of secrecy, deciding which parts of my living lifeways cannot exist so they can develop their nuclear waste repository. And the features are it's forced, it's race-based, and it's for profit. That's a problem. There's Yucca Mountain in the back with snow on the top. You can see the cinder cone volcanoes. The whole mountain is 90% saturated in the pores of the rock, or excuse me, 10% saturated in the pores of the rock with water. We're waiting for that water to come out. It's pure. So what I'm doing, the simplest thing, federally funded project must prove ownership free from significant encumbrances. This would help us on everything. Yucca Mountain, the Department of Energy, could not prove ownership. I have the only ownership contention. I don't have any letters behind my name. I don't seek to do that. I have work to do, and I'm getting on with it. I'm not seeking to become popular. I have research to do. I'm a research fellow at Liverpool University in England. I chose that because of Dr. Joseph Rotblat, who's the only physicist that withdrew from the Manhattan Project. We missed that turnoff then. And what we're doing is spiraling into, we lose our humanity when we pick up these weapons of war. And we're spiraling into brutality. We're spiraling into heinous crimes against humanity. So we need to stop it and go in a different direction. Thank you.
So we are going to have around 25 minutes for 30 minutes, good, for conversation. And I would like to invite Professors Hogg, Eng, Graver, and Mr. Subarte to come here just for an open conversation. So, thank you for your presentations to the four of you. Throughout this set of presentations, I have been thinking a lot about a kind of notion broader than genocide that has been coined by an indigenous Mapuche activist in South America, who is Moira Millán. She talks about the idea of terracide, something that is about killing Mother Earth from a pan-indigenous perspective. So we have been hearing throughout this panel from your presentations a lot about like the human impact of nuclear waste and radiation and all that as part of what is a sort of nuclear colonialism. So I have a kind of two questions to what in what terms we should also address like the effects of nuclear colonialism, not only in the kind of human dimension, but the non-human dimension, that of terroricide. And second, what are the possibilities and limits of politics and practices of reparative justice or reparation in these settings? Because David, you were talking about this kind of community-to-community act of reparation. And then you were talking about the role of artwork in that, or spiritual and religious, the use of religious and spiritual traditional practices from native tribes, and also your whole community-based advocacy for the tribal life, in your case, in the case of the Sahtu Dene nation. So what are the possibilities or the limits of this kind of acts and practices of reparation? Are they about reparative justice, or are they about also ways of quote unquote healing in a native sense? So that's my kind of question for all of you.
I'm interested in that word terracide because the invasion of both the California interior and the Great Basin beginning in the 19th century by Americans has also been described as a floricide, as a massive killing of the plant life that sustained native communities. So that's also, I think, something people have attended to, particularly because those communities, through an extensive, generationally created traditional ecological knowledge, knew the plant life so intimately and how to live in that landscape, including the basin, which looks like an unforgiving physical landscape in which to live, but that people knew how to live in because they had such a deep knowledge of the plant life, animal life, water life in that place. So I think it's really important that the sort of terracide that nuclear weapons and waste can create has actually been preceded by colonial invasions that created terracide or floricide long before. And I would say one example I've seen among Paiute peoples is an ongoing practice of both food gathering and dance traditions to try to keep those, to really kind of renew and sustain plant life that was almost destroyed So they practice annually forms of dance meant to celebrate some of that plant life that was central to them in the past, that was threatened, and that they have basically saved through incredible communal effort.
We have as much biodiversity in the Great Basin as the rainforests. We have bears, they have monkeys, but we have butterflies, rare plants and animals, lizards and turtles, and so much that it's worth seeing. It's worth going to see and have some respect, but no less the people as well. Unfortunately, what we have is 5,000 people a month moving to Las Vegas. They don't have a clue because everything looks new. And you all think the worst of people in Las Vegas. I live in Las Vegas. I'm doing the best, so hopefully that changes your perspective. I'm also hosting the International Uranium Film Festival at the end of April 30th and May 1st. It's a direct flight from here. And it'll be fun. There's going to be that component of fun, and it'll be the end of the Uranium Film Festival. So a lot of the directors and principals in some of these films are coming to this event. You can go to uraniumfilmfestival.org. I'm trying to create awareness, trying to create opportunities for people to experience what is happening there. We might do a site visit to the Nevada test site, to where the Kazakhs came, and we built a monument of rocks to those that have died as the Kazakhs did. They helped us build it at the gate there. Also, we could go to Yucca Mountain or even our community at Death Valley. We have the highest and lowest place in the world, and just across from where the old trees are is the highest mountain, Mount Whitney, in the Sierra range. There's a lot to protect and a lot of good reason to protect these things. And we just need other people, other Americans to stand up and recognize their responsibilities. All Americans have treaty rights with Indians. You have rights. That's how you are on the land. So at Yucca Mountain, the Department of Energy never thought they didn't own Shoshone Treaty territory. When it came to licensing, after spending $15 billion, could not prove ownership, as I questioned, because the Treaty of Ruby Valley is in full force and effect. So that's how these treaties can be used, not just by an Indian, but by you, other Americans, asserting your responsibility to restrain acts that would violate the peace. These weapons of war, these weapons of mass destruction violate every Indian peace treaty.
Luis, thank you for that question. When I think about terracide, I think about a dominant theme that has been running through our discussions all day, which is the limits of sovereignty. So we think about, and if you notice, the last chapter I called is Beyond Sovereignty, because I think that what we've come up against is the limits of the nation state and the limits of the state as a solution to the problems that we are talking about. And I think the great irony of post-colonial self-determination is the reinvention of sovereignty in a post-colonial and a decolonized context. When we talk about sovereignty, especially here in a law school, I think we have to ask, how do we redefine that so that land is not property, but land is about custodianship? And I think it's until we do that that we will never be able to imagine otherwise, and imagine how the world would probably be better without human beings in it, right? The human history on planet Earth is like a blip. And there's been more destruction of species life under human dominance of the Earth than in any other period. And so we had a question earlier this morning about beauty, about creativity, about art. And I was really struck by, Rebecca, your presentation, that I think one of the things that the human imagination can do is to try to imagine the finitude of human beings. So in my hat as a psychoanalytic theorist, Freud has an incredible essay that he wrote in 1916 called Reflections Upon War and Death. He was in a correspondence with Einstein about nuclear weapons. And they had this correspondence about war. But one of the things that he says in this op-ed, World War I, weapons of mass destruction, chemical gas, machine guns, all invented in this period. He says that humans cannot imagine their own death. And even when they do, they always imagine themselves as spectators. And, I am also a literary critic. So when you think about all the apocalypse films and that whole genre, there was always a band of human survivors to witness the demise of humanity. I think that we've been talking for the entire conference about the possibility of total human destruction, but I don't think that we are capable of actually imagining that.
If I can just add that the U.S. is currently preparing a underground test called Tickling the Tail of the Dragon, and they're going to spread plutonium in the groundwater 1,000 feet down at the Nevada test site. This is an environmental crime. They're trespassing in my country.
I really appreciate this conversation about the limits of the politics of recognition. And I think that this case in South Australia is really illustrative of this. One of the things that's really important when we're thinking about transnational comparisons and thinking about global indigeneity also is to remember that in Australia, no Aboriginal Indigenous nation has a treaty with the nation of Australia. There are no treaties for them to rely on, right? And so what this becomes is about relationships either between nations that have been organized as corporations or individuals advocating on behalf of their nations or advocating on behalf of themselves to their governments. And just recently, there was a referendum in Australia about acknowledging preference to Aboriginal rights in their parliament. The entire country of Australia had the opportunity to affirm Indigenous rights and a voice, and the country of Australia voted no. And they revealed the ways that they are very invested in their settler colonial narratives and not interested in prioritizing what they call the voice of Aboriginal people. And so once again, the politics of recognition here failed. And so this again really speaks to the importance of how art, community organizing, all the things that Beatrice so eloquently and Betty and others talked about yesterday, these small movements contributing to larger movements outside of the UN, outside of the law, right, as being able to be movers and shakers of public opinion, and the ways that we can do that outside of the legibility of science or the law or policing or enforcement through violence and other things, but how instead can we think about genealogies and connections and friendship and love through things of beauty, even though they're very much discussing horrific stories, horrific histories, horrific loss. And so the art enables to facilitate these conversations beyond what the state could ever recognize.
Thank you. So we have now some minutes for a couple of questions, or 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Yes. So is there a mic or?
Thank you so much for your presentation. It had me thinking about, the experience in the Marshall Islands of colonialism and the current rhetoric from the US towards the Marshallese people about nuclear testing, which is not, we are sorry, it is, thank you for your sacrifice. Here is some money, which, by the way, does not even begin to cover any of the damages, like in any significant ways, that relate to our perception of justice, which is restoring the environment, restoring harmony between peoples in a society so that we can live in harmony amongst each other. So all of your sharing was really interesting. Sorry if I was
dozing a bit. It's like very early in Fiji right now, so the jet lag. I was like, please stay awake. I need to like hear this. But I was really interested in your presentation, David, that about apologies. And so I started to think about how we've never actually received an official apology from the US, let alone like the recognition that this was wrong. And so now I'm like trying to process, what would an apology even mean? What would be the value of an apology? And I would like to hear from you, like from all of you, your experiences or your thoughts on that, to help us process. Like, we've always been asking for it, but when the apology comes, then what? If it comes. So thank you.
Thank you. So we are going to collect 2 more questions, and then you can elaborate on those questions.
Betty and I think alike. I was so taken by the apology remarks, and I'm completely with Betty. There are lots of things one can do to make things better. There can be victim assistance, there can be environmental remediation. There's a lot left to be done in the Marshall Islands, and as we saw throughout the day, obviously other places around the world, including here in the United States. But you start with saying, I'm sorry. You start with saying, I'm sorry. Since I got onto my mom theme in my earlier remarks, if my kids did something wrong in the playground, the first thing I wanted them to do is say, I'm sorry. And I simply do not think we can get to where we need to go if we don't start with the apology. It is absolutely essential. There is a model one can follow. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton's administration apologized to the victims and their families of the Tuskegee study. And the idea of an apology is, 1, you say you're sorry. 2, you say how you're going to make it better. And 3, you say how you're going to make sure it never happens again. And that's what we need on nuclear testing. That's what we need on nuclear harm. We need an apology campaign. That's what I'm feeling in this room. And let me just add one last thing. This goes back to some of the comments by Rebecca about what happened in Australia. In the Marshall Islands with Bravo, it's still a narrative. Everyone still talks about it was an accident and it was over. It was larger than expected and the winds blew. None of that is true. There are historical documents showing that they placed aircraft based on a Bravo yield between 12 and 20 megatons. Bravo was 15 megatons. You do not have to be a scientist to know that 15 is between 12 and 20. And then secondly, there are American weathermen on camera saying that the winds blew. They knew exactly where the winds were blowing, and they were blowing right at Rongelap Atoll. So the whole narrative, decades of it was an accident and it was bigger than we expected, and they weren't even sorry. Louis Strauss, whom you saw in the Oppenheimer film, was sort of there was a whole other story to his villainous behavior related to Bravo. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
One more.
Cooper, you're like Oprah.
You get hard.
Yeah, so time for one more. So, sorry. Yes.
Namia Alice Yaivin, thank you for the discussion. It was very fruitful, and there's so much weight and heaviness to these conversations. And I was curious to think through sort of the devastation and the world endings that happen with everything that was brought up in each of your presentations. And I'm curious about what does that
mean in terms of hope, which I know is coming in another discussion, or decolonial hope, or the politics of refusal or resiliency. Thinking through, living through world endings, and maybe world endings that have already happened, if we think of genocide not as an event, right, but often theorized as a structure and ongoing, and also thinking of genocides that have happened and genocides that are happening now. I'm wondering about living through world endings always in the context of what you all are speaking to, and perhaps what that means in terms of also creating catastrophe in order for something new. If the law is not, if the law is perhaps like and politics and the order of the governance of the ways that we live harm reduction, then what is the new world in light of all of this? And what does that catastrophe mean outside of this academic bubble that we are often in?
So thank you. We have a few minutes just for your brief responses to the different questions.
I just want to quickly follow up on genocide. The destruction of a people in whole or in part, or the infliction of conditions intended to bring about the destruction of a people in whole or in part. I got involved after the period of weapons testing above ground. Testing was going on underground in early 1980s, 1984. Our lands were targeted by the MX missile system, missile experimental, half of Utah, half of Nevada, which is mostly Shoshone country, inflicting conditions. Then the proposed high-level nuclear waste repository, and we learned about the weapons testing and the fallout, secret plutonium shipments recently, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensing process, and now the recent planned test tickling the tail of the dragon. The next generation doesn't quite understand or grasp the severity of the situation we are in. The United States created 13 federally recognized tribes out of my one Western Shoshone people. All Western Shoshone are related, about 20,000 of us. The United States uses blood quantum and taught us how to discriminate against our children, focusing that discrimination on our most vulnerable, the children. And now the greatest threat is sovereign acquiescence. If you have a Nevada driver's license or Utah or US passport, why do you need your own? I have a Shoshone passport, a valid Shoshone passport. I assert the sovereignty of the Shoshone Nation, and that is important to me because I need hope. My people need hope. Other Americans, you can help. That is hopeful for you.
I want to address the question about sort of world ending and responding to the possibility of the world ending. I actually think that that's why present day Native activists and artists invoke the ghost dance, because it's a legacy of another generation of Native people who anticipated the possible apocalyptic ending of their world and who envisioned something different out of it, right? And a kind of reordering, renewal, resetting of the conditions. And I think that that's why it continues to be a kind of powerful movement that even people who are from tribal nations that don't have a past with the ghost dance find themselves accessing in their own understanding of sort of apocalyptic conditions. So that's, to me, one of the most exciting aspects of it, is that it's both kind of realistic about threat, but also incredibly hopeful about possibility, like decolonial possibility.
Thank you for your questions. So I'm going to respond first to Betty and Ivano's questions and comments about apology and repair. I think that the key thing to remember from psychoanalysis and from object relations is that you can't repair something that's broken. The only thing that you can repair is a relationship. And so if you're going to repair, right, you repair only what's valuable to you. And if you want to translate that, then it's really you repair the relationships that are valuable to you. But you have to, as Yvonne was saying, repair them in a different way so that something else emerges from that scene. And this really is about a vocabulary. I put a lot of emphasis on the way in which law and psychoanalysis might supplement one another. And so as a verb, reparation, as long as you have relations with others, you always have to repair those relations. The concept of good and bad in Klein is, paradoxical. Like the act of repair is actually what creates a dividing line between what is constituted as a good object, worthy and valuable, and what is a bad object. And my emphasis on those bad objects abandoned by the state, we have so many examples of that. And we also have examples like the Sahtu Dene and the Korean hibakusha of bad objects abandoned by the state addressing and repairing each other. And so, the question about how we imagine decolonial hope, your question, is that I believe we, especially among the younger generation, there is an enormous fatigue with the state as a solution, with law as a solution. And we've talked a lot over the course of this day and a half about bottoms up and small communities really starting on that scale to imagine how to rethink a whole set of relationalities.
I think on the note of apology, another apology from the state that I want to mention is the 1993 apology to the Kanaka Maoli, the Native Hawaiian people, on the illegal overthrow of their nation. And the reason that I bring this up is because getting to David's point about the specificity of language mattering, because one of the things that's very important about this so-called apology to the Kanaka Maoli is that none of the apology had any legally binding teeth. There was no actual action or enforcement behind it. It's just an empty apology with no promises. And so what people learned in Hawaii after that was that they had to take to organizing, moving, and what the great Kanaka Maoli historian Miley Arvin calls regenerative refusal, refusing the state, looking towards this organizing, finding capacities in so many different movements. We can look at the movements around Mauna Kea, Pohakuloa, so many other anti-military actions that are taking place in Hawaii that are also, and to bring it back to all of this, right, are inspired by global indigenous movements from around the world in which people are learning and sharing and loving from one another that have nothing to do with the politics of recognition of the state and are rooted in these ancestral connections. So there's much that we can continue to learn and continue to appreciate.
Thank you. Let's express our deep gratitude towards our four speakers, please. Thank you.